Today, we start with the legend of the Lillooet Cattle Drive from 1872-1873, and George Vanderwolf is with us from Lillooet. George has lived in Lillooet for 64 years. He's worked as a prospector, a game guide, a trapper, a rancher, and in road construction. George married a local girl, Karen Osterland, when he was 20 and she was 17. Karen's grandfather came to the region in 1896 as he was going to the Klondike, but he found gold in the Bridge River, so he stayed, preempting 160 acres. George has been an advocate of Lillooet's rich history for many years. He was very involved in the Jaywalk feature through the downtown area, which you must see if you haven't checked it out. So thanks so much, George, for coming down to see us and telling us this tale from Lillooet. We have a lot of eager listeners.
Well, after that introduction, I don't know about this. I didn't think there was that many people left that wanted to hear some lies. But way back in 1858, early 60s, Lillooet was quite a town. They had miners coming from all over the world, and Lillooet at one time had as many as 16,000 people. It's hard to believe we're down to 3,000 now, or 2,500. But Lillooet was the place to be, because from there they could get up north and they would find the gold that they were all looking for. Now these miners, when they came through, they all needed grub. They were looking for gold. But there was ranchers and farmers and gardeners and packers and whatnot in Lillooet that figured they could get gold easier by supplying these guys with whatever they needed. Now, they can grow anything in Lillooet, all the way from potatoes to apples. But the one thing, it's hard to believe, but the one thing that was most important, a miner could go a week with no grub, but he couldn't go 2 hours without a smoke. So Jonathan Scott decided he would make a tobacco farm, and that is exactly what he did. He grew tobacco for these miners by the acre. His grave is still up on the hill. When you stand in Lillooet and you look across over to East Lillooet, you will see a bit of a mound in a big flat, and there's a white picket fence around Jonathan Scott's grave. He was considered a real hero to them miners. Now the start of this cattle drive was actually on Pavilion Mountain with Robert Carson. When these miners were in Lillooet, Carson was supplying them with beef, people were supplying them with food, but by 1870, 90% of these miners had gone north. So here were all these fellows that had beef and they had produce, but they had no one to sell it to. So in 1882 to 1883, they proposed to build a trail from Lillooet to the coast, so they could move cattle down to the coast, because there was the demand for beef in Vancouver and so on. So they convinced their local MP, or MLA, who was Tom Humphrey at the time, that this was a good idea. He convinced the government, and they started building a trail. They started this trail in 1873. They completed it by 1887. This is when the cattle drive started, in 1887. Now, a bunch of ranchers got together, they pooled their cattle, and they wound up with 200 head of cattle to take to market. Now this trail was 165 miles long, but it was only 3 feet wide. Can you imagine trying to chase 200 head of cattle along them bluffs on Seton Lake and Anderson Lake on a 3-foot trail? But when Carson started out from Pavilion, which is 26 miles northeast of Lillooet, with these cattle, the first problem he came to was swimming the Fraser River. Now, as you folks know, the Fraser is a pretty skookum river. And they started this cattle drive in November. Now, most people would say, why in the world would you start a cattle drive in November when there's no more feed? Well, the Fraser was the reason they had to do that. That's low water in the Fraser. If you tried to swim them cattle across in high water, they'd be in hope before you get rid of them across the river. So that's why they started the cattle drive in November of 1887. And there was only 3 cowboys. There was Robert Carson, fellow rancher by the name of Holy, and an Indian cowboy. Now, these other cattle drives, and there's been cattle drives all over the world. The ones in Texas were famous. The Americans seen to that they were well advertised. The ones in the Chilcootin, they were tough drives. But the one drive that really gets your attention is the one that Norman Lee did from Lee's Corner in the Chilcootin to the Yukon. But even that cattle drive did not go through as tough a country as the Lillooet Cattle Drive. The Lillooet Cattle Drive has to be the toughest piece of country that God ever made around here. So there we started out in November. They swam them cattle across the Fraser, and they didn't lose any. And they started out this 3-foot trail from Lillooet. Well, it took them quite a while, because these cattle, like I said, you've got a 3-foot trail, you've got 200 head of cattle, and you've got to run them one at a time down this trail. Now, they came along Anderson or Seton Lake, Anderson Lake, and they got to Pemberton. And it's hard to believe, but the first feed they found, because there's none along Anderson Lake, there's none along Seton Lake, the first feed they found was around Darcy. So they had to stop and let those cattle graze a while to try and get, but in November there isn't much to eat, so they had to wait a while to get them cattle fed up a bit. When they got to Pemberton, there was a few meadows around here that they managed to get cattle feed on. But by this time, this was a month since they left Lillooet already, and now the snow is coming, the rain is coming. It is one miserable piece of country to drive through, and the trail, when you run 200 head of cattle down the same trail, that last cow is probably belly deep in mud because they've tramped everything out. But anyway, they were a very determined bunch, and they kept going down. Now, when they went through this country, they went through Pemberton, got through Alta Lake, down through the Cheakamus River, and they got down to Howe Sound. But there was no railroad, there was no highways, there was nothing. Down at Squamish was just a logging town. And everything came in by boat to Squamish. There was no trails of any kind. So they decided they had to go across from Squamish, take some creek. Now, I don't know which creek they took, but they took a creek from Squamish over the ridge, and they wound up down at Howe Sound with these cattle. Well, by the time they got them there, they'd lost quite a few. They had to shoot some, and they were a pretty sorry looking lot of cattle. So he scoured them across, he put them on scows, took them across Burrard Inlet. He managed to sell a few of them to the meat markets in Vancouver, Gastown as it was known in those years. And then the rest he took over to a farm in Richmond, and he was going to fatten up these cattle over the winter so that he could sell them in the spring. Well, as luck would have it, while he was on this ranch down there fattening up these cattle, the next door neighbor had a good-looking daughter. And between him looking at this good-looking daughter, and she's looking at this adventurous cowboy, well, they got together and they got married. And they sold the cattle, but now he had some money. He got married, and now he's heading home. Well, to go back home, he went as far as Yale on a stern wheeler. Then they got on a stagecoach, and they got back to Pavilion Mountain, where Robert Carson and his new wife, they had 2 sons, and both of them wind up as government people. One was the MLA for Lillooet area, the other was an MP for Ottawa. And so the Carson family became very famous, and that ranch that he established is still there to this day. Matter of fact, the Diamond S ran it for years, and they just sold this ranch to what they call the Blue Goose Ranching Company, which is out of Alberta, and they're now raising organic beef on this same ranch. So this ranch and this family is quite historic in Lillooet, and their relations are still there. There's the Brysons, which are related to the Carsons, are still there in Lillooet. There's quite a family of them, and the ranch is still going as a ranch. But now, you can imagine the hardships these people went through to get those cattle from here to there. And I don't think anybody today would even attempt such a thing, even if they had to. In those years, it was the same as Norman Lee. When they told Norman Lee, you can't do something, he immediately set out to prove you were wrong. And I believe that Robert Carson was the same type of person. They told him it was ridiculous, you can't do this, and so therefore he was bound, determined he was going to do it, and they did. And that basically is the story of the Lillooet Cattle Drive. And it's associated here with Pemberton because they had to go through Pemberton, and they stayed here for quite some time in order to feed them cattle up a little bit. And now if you folks got any questions, I'm glad to answer them.
George, I just wanted to make a comment that another fellow who's presented here had shown a photo of a plaque that's down at the head of Burrard Inlet talking about Carson's Cattle Drive.
Yes.
So would that have been his sons?
I don't know who put the plaque up, but there is a plaque down there on House Sound commemorating this cattle drive. And I don't know who put it up, and I don't know when they put it up, but it is there. It is there.
So it is in Vancouver or in Squamish, this plaque?
I had understood there was a plaque in Vancouver, and then maybe there's one in Squamish, or maybe I misunderstood it.
No, it's right, it's the north end between Lynn and Seymour Creeks. That's where the plaque is, or it was when I saw it.
Okay.
Because that's where they came out on Burrard Inlet, in between Lynn and Seymour Creeks.
According to historical records, they actually came out on Lynn Creek. But we don't know what creek they went from Squamish over to get to the headwaters of Lynn. I don't know what, there's half a dozen creeks there, and I don't know which one they took to get there. But I don't care which one they took. Got to House Sound in January, near the end of January.
It's pretty good travel for a
And
bunch of cattle.
it's quite a remarkable feat when you think of it. Most people would have started that cattle drive in the summer. But like I explained, the reason they started it in November was because they had to swim the Fraser River. And there's no way you're going to swim the Fraser River in high water.
Yeah.
That would have been before the Hell's Gate collapsed into the Fraser.
Excuse me?
When the Fraser River became blocked with the...
Oh, well, that was in later years.
Yes, that's what I was
Yeah,
thinking, so
that
the
was in the
water would be even
1920s when the
faster.
CN or CP was coming through and they
Yeah.
blocked the Hell's Gate. But you see, the Fraser River at Lillooet is very wide, but they did have a ferry there before they had a bridge. They had a ferry, and the ferry, the cattle went from the east side of Lillooet. There's a big bar there. In low water, there's a big bar in the middle, so they swam them to that bar, then they swam from that bar over to the Lillooet side. But in high water, them bars disappear completely, so you got no in between. Funny, you line them up one ahead of the other, but there's always one wants to get by the other one.
Yeah.
My understanding is that there was a Carson ranch and then there was another ranch up up on that plateau, was there, or
Yes, there was a.
Heelan or something?
I can't remember the first name, but his last name was Hoey. And they're quite famous, their family was quite famous there too. But they actually got together, they had about 5 or 6 ranches. Because Carson only had 65, Hoey had about 45, so that was the first 100. But then they put together another 100 from other ranchers. But the mystery is, why didn't some of the other ranchers help them chase those cattle? There was only 3 of them. And I've chased a considerable amount of cattle in my life, and I know if you only got 3 cowboys and no cow dog, you got a job in your hands. Because a good cow dog is worth 3 cowboys. And he's cheaper to keep, too.
That last stage of the journey where you said you're not sure which creek they went over, could they have gone over Indian Arm? Would that have been possible? Indian River, from Squamish over the Indian River down to Fraser Island, could that have been a route?
Well, you
It's a
see,
little out of the way.
there's at least 4 or 5 creeks between Squamish and North Vancouver. And any one of them, they could have taken up any one of them. But if you drive through that country and take a look up there, I don't care which one they took, they had a tough time getting over that hill. Yeah. But once again, I thank you folks for coming.